I think you just heard with that prompt, we're recording this meeting and we'll be putting it up online shortly once the file has processed. So I just want to show a few introductory slides to kick things off. First, here's the obligatory technical slide. We're using WebEx as a platform. You are all panelists, all of the working group members, and so you should be able to mute and unmute yourselves as well as turn your camera on and off. I'd like to ask if folks don't mind turning on their cameras, it'll feel much more like we're in a room in a working group together. We really appreciate it. You can also change your name, you just hover over your video and click on the three dots in case your name isn't showing up the way that you like it. If you have any technical issues, our assistant Abby can help you and you can send her a direct chat. If you'd like to participate in the discussion, you can do that by raising your hand or typing something into the chat. We'll be paying attention to both throughout the meeting. To raise your hand, just click on the little hand icon in the bottom of your screen. And I don't think anybody's dialing in, but in case somebody ends up having to dial in, you just dial *3 to raise your hand from a phone. Members of the public that are joining, you all are joining as attendees. And so you can only message with Abby, but you can also submit clarifying questions via the Q&A if you have a question that you'd like clarified. And we'll talk about other options for sharing your thoughts a little bit further on. So with that, I think I'm going to move on to the next slide. Hopefully everybody has the technical piece in hand. And I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of this group. So this is an opportunity to inform the development of our state's energy strategy. We brought you all here together because we want to listen to your thoughts and questions. We really value your expertise and your lived experience. We're going to be covering kind of three areas. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of foundational data sources that we're using for the modeling and answering any clarifying questions. We're also looking for you to help us think through key assumptions and also scenarios. So I'm combining the second and third bullets here. That we will kind of incorporate into the modeling to help us answer tough questions about how we meet our climate and energy goals. Just a reminder that the focus is on the modeling. We'll have a discussion of policies and work on developing policy recommendations, but that will be phase 2, and that process will start early next year. So today we're really just talking about the modeling. So here's a quick agenda. So right now, this is the welcome and introduction. I have a few slides to help set the stage. I'll then pass it to Jeremy Hargreaves from Evolved Energy Research, who is our consultant as part of the consortium with the Clean Energy Transitions Institute, and he will walk us through kind of how the power system is being modeled and what the approach is to different parts of the power system. And then we're going to jump into a discussion. And we have 2 hours total start to finish, so hopefully that leaves us time to have a pretty robust discussion here. This is who we have here today. Hopefully, I'm not doing a cross check here. One of my colleagues will be doing that. So we're really lucky, really fortunate to have such a knowledgeable group of folks in the room. And this is a little bit different than the roster that you may have seen in an agenda that we sent around earlier. We've been updating it as we've gotten some confirmations over the past few days. So I'm going to hand the mic over to Jeremy for a moment to introduce himself and the SETI team. Jeremy.
Thanks, Edith. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Hargreaves. I'm a principal at Evolved Energy Research and leading up the technical modeling work for the project. It's a project that's being led by the Clean Energy Transition Institute, Eileen and Ruby, and Eileen is on the call. And we have other members of the technical modeling team on the call as well today. Elaine Hart from Momentum Energy Insights, and Angela Long from Rockcrest Consulting. And others on the team are not here today, but are helping us do the work.
Thanks, Jeremy. And you'll hear more from Jeremy shortly. So I also just, by way of introductions, I wanted to encourage everyone to share your name and who you're representing in the chat. geographic location you represent and a fun highlight from your weekend, so we can all, even though we're remote, get to know each other a little bit. And I see at least one or maybe two people from the last meeting, so you can repeat what you said in the last meeting on land use, or you can share something new. So, and just in the chat. So I will just say that I picked blackberries this weekend and have been eating my fill. I don't think it's possible to eat your fill of blackberries, but there's only a few weeks where they're perfectly ripe. So my kids and I have cut up arms and legs from getting into the thickets to get the best blackberries. Oh, peach picking. Awesome. That sounds great. All right. I would love to dwell on this social piece, but I'm going to keep moving. But I encourage everyone to just kind of peruse who's in the room and what people have been up to. So I'm going to go into a little introduction to help set the stage for our conversation. A couple of these slides you all might recognize from the kickoff meeting that we had last week. So one of the main points here is that right now we're in phase 1, which is the technical approach, as I mentioned. And we have a number of different engagements that we're undertaking during this process, kind of in parallel to each other. So this is one of 8 working groups that we're convening. We also have an advisory group that's made up of 29 people that's meeting once a month. We have an interagency group that's also meeting roughly once a month and serves to ensure interagency alignment on policy and on data. We had a couple of listening sessions last week, so those are kind of the public forum for folks to share with us their priorities and the kinds of things that they would like to see or are concerned about or excited about in an energy strategy. And it's also important to highlight that we're engaging and consulting with tribes and with EJ and equity groups, and that we have some webinars sprinkled throughout. Generally, the webinars are to present something ahead of time or to reflect back on where we've landed on something. So I want to pause here for a moment just to talk a little bit more and elaborate a bit on the goal of the working group. So and kind of how you fit in this whole process. So the working groups are helping us to really inform the modeling. So we'll be providing information on the data sources that we're using and on some starting points in some cases for key assumptions, but we're really looking to you and to your expertise and to your experience on how we can make sure that we are kind of balancing out the kinds of questions that we're asking and the way that we're framing up the modeling in a way that kind of tracks with what you know about the energy system. The goal of this meeting and of the other working group meetings is not to come to a conclusion on any given assumption or scenario. We're here to hear your views, to hear your recommendations. We're relevant to hear kind of what information sources you have, and in some cases, folks are willing to share. That's great. We're going to take what we hear today and we're going to work through it. So there's a lot of overlap between our groups. Even in preparing this presentation, we have a transmission and distribution group, and we're also touching on transmission here. We have an energy efficiency and load flexibility group also overlap here. And so we're going to have to take what we hear and try to kind of put it all together. And that's also why we have a meeting on August 22nd, where we'll bring all of the working groups back together and we'll present what we've heard and where we've landed in synthesizing what we've heard and coming up with a draft modeling proposal. And we'll be presenting that to you all for discussion and for feedback. So in evaluating what we've heard, just to give you a little bit of a kind of insight into how we're thinking about this, we'll apply some decision-making guideposts and kind of that synthesis that I was just talking about from all the working groups. So we plan to use the best available information, and we've already been working with data holders, with sister agencies, with utilities, with regional organizations and others to understand and incorporate the best data available, including the most, to the extent possible, Oregon-specific data. The model needs to produce results that meet our climate goals. Jeremy will talk about that more specifically, but that's one of the things that's kind of baked in. We're also working to ensure that we maintain a reliable energy system, so that reliability is also built into the model. And we'll be looking to understand what the lowest cost options are. We recognize that there are many non-energy costs and benefits. And that's something that we will be looking at in some cases outside of the model itself, but we'll be conducting some analysis to evaluate some of these non-energy areas like jobs, bill impacts, equity and environmental justice impacts, effects on land use and natural resources. We had a working group on that topic just this morning. And where information is not aligned that we hear, we're going to work to assess the pros and cons of different choices, of different things that we've heard in the working groups. Based on these, to inform our conclusions based on kind of these principles of best available information, meeting our climate goals, lowest cost options, non-energy costs and benefits, reliability. It's also important to note that we're not making any policy decisions. So this is a model. The modeling is going to inform a policy discussion. And where we'll be developing policy recommendations. But in the end, the document that's going to come out here of this whole process is a strategy. It's not a plan. And it's being presented to the governor and legislature, and it's up to them to use the information as they best see fit. Okay, I realize I've been talking too much. 2 hours is not very much time. We're kind of operating here on the expectation that you all joined or had a chance to listen to the July 30th working group meeting. That's where Jeremy kind of laid out the foundation of how the modeling of the energy system is going to look. And today we'll dig into we'll dig more into electricity generating technologies and how that piece of the puzzle works. 2 hours is a lot, but also not a lot. So I realize that in some cases there might be new information that you need to synthesize or you need to go discuss with colleagues. So we're also encouraging folks to be active in this call and also to feel free to send us your thoughts afterwards. And we have a public comment portal on our website where you can do that, and you can also do it by email. Okay, so that was the long slide. And now I'm just going to remind us of the guidance that House Bill 3630 provides us on what the energy strategy has to take into account at minimum. So you can see here the list. We showed this in that webinar last week. We need to account for state energy demands and trends, energy resource and technology choices, considering their resource profiles and energy efficiency, feasibility, availability, existing and potential incentives to support energy efficiency. We're looking across the whole system, generation, transmission, distribution, emerging technologies and investment opportunities. And again, we're really emphasizing the importance of environmental justice, community benefits, looking at land use considerations, at energy burden and affordability, economic and employment impact, energy security and impacts of broader markets. So we're very aware of the and following the discussions that are happening at a regional level on markets, energy resilience and community energy resilience. So it's a tall order, but an exciting project. So again, this is also from the launch webinar, but I thought it was important to just summarize again. The bill does not define energy policy objectives. So this is what we're focusing on in looking at how we meet our energy policy objectives out to 2050 and intermediate timeframes where they apply. So we're looking at Executive Order 2004, which has an 80% greenhouse gas reduction goal by 2050. We're looking at HB 2021, which applies to our largest electricity IOUs, which is 100% clean by 2040. And we're looking at the climate protection program with the 90% by 2050 greenhouse gas reduction target, and are following that process that DEQ is leading. And finally, and I would say kind of like last but not least in a way, that there are a lot of really important policies that are driving and shaping the compliance pathways to meet these broader overarching targets. And those are really, really important. So the Clean Fuels Program, Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks, building codes, various appliance standards. There are a lot of policies that shape kind of the how we undertake and achieve this energy transition. quick summary of the modeling approach. This is the highest level, I would say. You might recognize this slide also from last week. It's a graphic depiction of our approach to the modeling. So in the middle, there's a reference scenario, and the reference is essentially a combination of reasonable assumptions that achieve compliance with our climate and energy objectives out to 2050. And those assumptions, again, are part of what we'll be discussing today. And then we have 5 alternative scenarios to test what might happen if things work out differently than in the reference. We know there are a lot of uncertainties, and there's this opportunity to test those uncertainties and understand what happens. I'll pause here that neither the reference nor the alternative scenarios are meant to forecast the future. Instead, they're meant to lay out some of the ways we might meet our energy goals. So what I now call the secret sauce is in what we learn between the reference and the alternative scenarios. So when we change something between the reference and an alternative scenario, everything else is maintained kind of as it was in the reference. And so you can see then what changes. So for example, if in one scenario we have a lot of transmission build out and in another transmission expansion is constrained, what we learn is not how much transmission we need or how much we're going to get, because nobody knows that. But what we learn is what more or less transmission means for overall cost, for what's built inside and outside of Oregon, what kinds of resources are built, and those conclusions then help us understand the implications of different pathways and of different potential futures. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy and let him run us through how he is approaching the electricity system modeling. Jeremy, floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Edith. So I'm going to give a brief recap on what we talked about in the kickoff, an overview of what the modeling looks like, and then I'll go into some of the features of the electricity sector modeling. It's still going to be a pretty high level introduction to it, just given the time that we have. And so if people have questions that want to dig a little deeper, then please let us know and we can address those. So as a recap of where we left off with the previous presentation, we're starting with this model of Oregon's economy, this bottom-up representation of all of the energy consuming technologies across Oregon and all of the different subsectors, and then thinking about how those technology stocks might evolve over time. And the principal way that we do that is through assumptions about sales share. And so, for example, when a customer is going to replace their vehicle and they go to the dealership, are they buying a new electric vehicle or are they buying an internal combustion engine vehicle? So we have a lot of assumptions going into the model as inputs about how customers might behave over time. And that's the result of policy, of incentives. And this builds a picture between now and 2050 on what types of energy customers are consuming, as well as the timing of that consumption, which is particularly important for the electricity sector. And so hourly shapes that have weather impacting them are filtering through from this model of the demand side into that second bucket, that an aggregate need of energy in Oregon of all types. So liquid fuels, gaseous fuels, and electricity. And the electricity load is going to be the result of the changing ways in which Oregon consumes energy, electrification over time, potentially other forecasted loads coming into Oregon. And this aggregate energy need is then taken by our supply side model, which is a capacity expansion and operations model. And that's looking at how do we supply energy reliably and at least cost. And this is constrained by our clean energy goals. It's constrained by our emissions target. And this is least cost within a particular scenario. And so as Edith was describing, we have a reference scenario. We have 5 other scenarios. And we can use those to look at uncertainties about whether we don't get what we might want to get in the reference scenario, or we can use them to look at different policy priorities or priorities among different objectives in the state. And so if jobs growth or environmental concerns within the state are things that we want to look at specifically with these other scenarios, we can constrain those when we're looking at each of these 5 and determine what that means for investments in resources and potentially near-term policy setting. The next slide. So we take that modeling approach I just described and we nest that in the data needs. So the modeling approach is that middle bar there. We have the best available data going in. This is the underpinning data to the models. On the demand side, it's things like the energy service demands over time. So how much heat, how much light, how much steam, how much cooling are people requiring? And then the ways that we are meeting that service demand. So the technology stocks, what do they look like today? What are the technology options for customers to adopt over time? And what are the costs and operating characteristics of those, including the hourly shapes if we're talking about the electricity sector? The same sort of thing on the supply side, going into our Rio model. We are characterizing the existing system with what infrastructure is out there right now, and then thinking about how that can change in the future. So what are the options that the model can invest in? And this is building out supply chains for all types of energy. So it's building out the electricity sector, it's building out fuels production supply chains to meet the energy needs in every part of the economy. And then moving to the top of the diagram there, scenario assumptions. These are the things that are characterizing the scenarios that Edith described and that process that I described of representing potentially different policy priorities and different uncertainties. And these are things like the amount of vehicle sales. What are people buying in the years coming? In transportation, in buildings, in industry. We're looking at the impact of policies like IRA that would drive different customer adoption. And then the supply side assumptions, these are things that are characterizing what resources are available to us in the future. So how hard is it to site and permit new renewables, new transmission, and those types of assumptions. And those are defining what our scenarios look like, as well as the emissions targets, the clean energy targets. Next slide. So a note on forecasting versus this term backcasting. This is a kind of a paradigm that's useful to understand in this long-term modeling to kind of frame the way that we are thinking about future decisions. And so forecasting in this context, we would describe as projecting changes forward in time based on expected customer behavior right now. So the way that we've seen customers behaving already, the way that incentives might drive change in customer adoption, the way new technologies, we could forecast them changing things. So it's like looking at the results of current policy and the evolution from where we are in our current system. Backcasting is looking at the end goal. So if we want to achieve emissions goals in the future, clean electricity goals, then we start at that end point. That's where we want to end up, and then work backwards from that to infer what kind of customer adoption we'd like to see, what kind of investments in the electricity sector we would like to see. And so this is looking at how do we place ourselves on the best path towards those future goals. And so it goes beyond present policy and present levels of customer adoption and thinks about what would we like to see in the future. And the gap between present policy and that action in the future is one that we could think about filling in setting future policy in the state. And the chart at the bottom there on the right-hand side is indicating the sort of imperative for policy impacting different types of infrastructure investment. So we think about appliances in buildings. They may have a 10-year lifetime, and we would have 2 or 3 bites of the apple to replace those appliances. So if a customer is going to the store today to replace an air conditioning unit, then they probably have to replace that 2 or 3 times more before 2050 comes around. If we're talking about central AC or furnaces, then maybe the lifetime is a little bit longer. There's perhaps fewer opportunities, vehicles even less so. And then once we're talking about things like boilers in industry, power plants, if we're investing in one of these types of technology today, then they're probably going to be there in the 2040s or even 2050 when we're hitting the 80% target. And so investments in this type of infrastructure, we need to make sure that they are serving a useful purpose in a changing future. So it's valuable today, but it's still a valuable piece of a portfolio in the future as well. Next slide. So I made the points here already, so we can skip this slide. Thinking about load growth in the electricity sector, we are modeling approximately 80 demand sectors across the economy, and using that methodology that I described in the previous kickoff meeting, where we have sales shares translating into stocks over time, translating to energy use of all types. So we're talking about electrification of the vehicle sector. Then we'll see displacement of fossil fuel use and more electric growth over time. And then we're factoring in uncertainty into the different scenarios that we're looking at. So in the reference case, we'll have some assumption about how much electrification we think is going to happen going forward on the demand side, how much data center growth we might see. But there's opportunities to look at different levels of these inputs, depending on what we want to use those 5 scenarios for. So maybe there's different levels of electrification or different levels of data center growth that we could investigate the consequences of that in the future. Next slide. Okay, so talking about the electricity sector integration with the rest of the fuel supply chain system, we are going to see an increasingly integrated energy system across electricity and other sectors as we move forward in time. And we already see the beginnings of this today as we're building out electrolyzers that are served by renewable energy. So what our model is doing is investing optimally in every part of the electricity and fuel supply chain. So that means commodities, conversion technologies, transportation, storage, delivery to customers. And I'm showing on the right-hand side here an example for hydrogen, where we have clean energy going into electrolysis. That hydrogen produced can go into multiple different pathways. So it could go into methanation and synthetic methane production that could be injected into gas pipelines. The hydrogen could be injected directly into gas pipelines or into 100% hydrogen pipelines. The hydrogen could go to Fischer-Tropsch synthesis to produce liquid fuel fractions as drop-in fuels for transportation. Or it could go into Haber-Bosch process to produce ammonia. The ammonia could displace current ammonia consumption for things like fertilizer, but it could also go into maritime transportation fuels. And this affords us new opportunities in the electric sector, because rather than having to balance the electric sector with only electricity resources, we now have these large flexible loads developing over time that can contribute also to flexibility and to longer scale flexibility. So electrolysis is a relatively cheap technology relative to the overall cost of hydrogen. You know, most of the cost there is from the energy that is required to produce hydrogen. And so overbuilding electrolyzers is one way of getting more flexibility in the system. So when you have a lot of renewable energy available, you could produce a lot of hydrogen. And when you don't have renewable energy available, you could back it off. So that affords opportunities on short-term balancing timescale as well as potentially seasonal balancing opportunities. Next slide. We are modeling a large model geography. We have a state level representation across the West. We're modeling North California, South California, and we're splitting Oregon into two zones. So we'll have an eastern zone and a western zone, and this is capturing the competition for resources outside of Oregon. So as other states are also transitioning to clean electricity, to emissions reduction goals, Oregon can't just cherry pick the best resources from around the West. It's in competition with these other states. And so we are recognizing Oregon as one part of a much larger electricity network. It's part of national fuels networks, and we're representing it as such. So we get realistic solutions on the types of investments needed. Next slide. We are modeling potential expansion of interstate transmission, and the data set that we have to represent this is from the Nature Conservancy Power Place West study, where we worked with transmission engineers and other modeling teams to develop a representation of the pathways between states. And this included identification of the current corridors, the opportunities to reconductor those corridors, the opportunities to expand those corridors and co-locate lines, and the opportunities for greenfield transmission development. And all of those have costs associated with them and additional megawatts of capacity associated with them. The costs for Power Place West transmission expansion are quite high relative to previous data sets. They are much higher, for example, than the NREL REITs costs, which, you know, the limited set of transmission projects that we've seen completed recently have overshot their projected costs and have been much higher than what we've seen in the NREL data set. And so I think it's conservative and reasonable to be using this higher cost data set for transmission expansion. Next slide. So finally, on the modeling methodology here, we're modeling reliability inside of the model. So we're not specifying a reliability need outside to say that there is a peak load requirement in a particular hour, or there's effective load carrying capabilities of particular resources, because we know that those things are going to change over time. As we see electrification happening on the system, it's going to change when the peak loads happen. The effective load carrying capability of different resources is going to change with the load, with the additional resources, renewable resources added. And the other factor here is that increasingly, as we go into a high renewable future, it is not going to be a capacity limitation, but an energy limitation to be able to maintain a reliable system. And so we're making sure that we're representing the capability of energy limited resources to contribute reliability. So that includes different storage technologies. It includes systems that include fuel storage and hydro system. Next slide. And just to end here, a note on the hydro system modeling. So we are representing the hydro system as a zone by zone aggregate hydro resource. And we're characterizing that using historical generation data. So currently in our model, this is characterized by looking back over many years of WECC hydro production data and then aggregating that by zone. And we're constraining that, one, by the daily energy budget. So we have to meet a particular daily energy budget when we're modeling out into the future. And we're also constraining the ramping capability to the maximum 1 hour and the maximum 6 hour ramps from the historical data set, so that we can somewhat get at river section flow constraints. We're incorporating a low, medium, and high hydro year and their relative frequency in the historical record. So the low hydro year is probably going to be characterizing our capacity need on the rest of the system, but representing the other years gives us a better estimation of what the operations of the system will look like, as well as the overall costs. And we've been in discussions with the Northwest Power Council recently on updating this representation to incorporate their hydro modeling, which looks to be compatible with the way that we are representing it. And so this will hopefully give us the capability of including some climate impacts going forward and changing operations of the hydro system. So I will leave it there and open up for any questions that people have.
Jeremy, we have a few questions that were in the chat. And I can flag the first one from David Bantoff. Will scenarios look at different timing windows? For instance, how IOUs meet the 2030 energy targets may take different strategies than meeting the 2040 or 2050 targets.
Yeah, so when we are modeling investments over time, we're modeling on 5-year time steps. And so we will have 2025, 2030, 35, 40, 45, 50. And each year will have to comply with the policy that is in effect for that year. So the 2030 time period, the compliance in that year will be aligned with what Oregon has to achieve by 2030, and then subsequently 2035 and so on. And what we will find is that the investments that we make for that year will be sufficient to meet the emissions targets, the clean electricity targets, but they're also in the context of achieving the targets beyond that. And so we're not investing in near-term investments that might lock in emissions, but be compliant with, say, 2030. We're investing in technologies that will serve us as a part of a portfolio over the longer term as well. So basically, we're minimizing costs, not just through 2030, but through 2050.
Can we do follow-up or no?
Yeah, I was going to ask David, do you have a follow-up?
Well, I'm just trying to understand that answer. Because at least the way I think of it is you may need to do whatever the strategy is, certain investments to stay on the 2030 targets, that from, if you're only looking at it from a longer term, like the 2040, 2050 window, might not be the least cost investment strategy, but to achieve those targets, it becomes least cost because it's the only way you can get there by 2030. It's just an example if that were to be the case. But it sounded like you were saying, Jeremy, that you would not select those short-term strategies that don't have synergy with long-term strategy least cost choices.
So I think that we're saying the same thing, in that we have to be investing in short-term strategies to achieve the targets. But for example, if in the long term we were investing in technology that complied with 2030 but significantly drove costs up in the future relative to some alternative investment, then we wouldn't do that. We're minimizing cost across the entire time period. So it's it is the sum of the discounted cost over the entire time period that we're minimizing for. And so it is making sure that we are compliant in the near term, but that we are on a pathway that is that is least cost across the entire time period. So it's sort of giving us that forward-looking perspective rather than making investments just on achieving the near-term targets.
And
Does
so
that
last,
clarify?
just really quick, last follow-up. If, and I may be missing what part of what you're saying, but is it possible then that you would say, well, to achieve the 2030 targets, you'd have to do X, but that would not be least cost longer term. So so we wouldn't select that route. We'd select the more cost efficient longer term route, and the cost would be we would not achieve the targets for 2030.
No, we would always achieve the targets.
Okay, so it's just as long as you just try to maximize the benefit of the longer term synergies with whatever those choices are.
Exactly, but we have to be compliant in every year with the policy.
Thank you, David and Jeremy. So I see there's another question. I'm just running through the chat here from Shannon Sosa, who says she's curious about the projected new generation driven by clean fuels noted in the Net Zero Northwest model, and noted that in the Net Zero Northwest model there was very little biofuel inclusion, and why that is so. Also wondering to what extent aerospace and maritime are included in the overall clean fuels demand. So there's two questions there, one on biofuels and one on aerospace and maritime.
So everything is included in the fuels demand. So we're meeting the fuels demand across the whole economy. There are different qualifying restrictions under CPP as to which of these fuels need to be decarbonized, and so that is one factor that would be impacting where decarbonized fuels get used. The biofuels question, so that is one that I think we will see some changes from the previous Net Zero Northwest study, just because our latest modeling includes alcohol to X, which is, very recently become a viable commercialized technology, and we see the first plants going in this year. But that gives us a route now for corn ethanol production that previously we didn't see. So there's vast quantities of corn ethanol that are being blended into gasoline right now. And in our previous work, that tended to just be retired over time because there wasn't an alternative route for that to be used. But now that corn ethanol can go into alcohol to X and be converted into other liquid fuel fractions, and it can decarbonize pieces of the economy that it couldn't before. So rather than retire corn production, we now see this transition happening into alcohol to X. So that's one reason why we'll probably see a little bit more biofuels happening. The other factor in studies prior to IRA, we always saw a lot of biofuels in our results, and that was because they were cheaper than hydrogen-derived alternatives. But the IRA through 2032 it really favors hydrogen production over the use of new biomass sources, and so that's driving a larger hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels economy than what we would see without the 45V and 45Q tax credits.
Could I have a quick follow-up there?
Yep.
I would encourage you to look at the IRA, specifically the IRS's interpretation of that with respect to the Northwest hydroelectric system. Also to corn ethanol, that's wonderful, but what we do here is timber basket and a lot of wildfire lighter fuel. We also have a lot of other ag waste products that the IRA does promote. And we see that the Forest Service and United States Department of Energy are also leaning in heavily. So I would encourage you to kind of rethink that for our region, and would be happy to offline on that.
Sure. Yeah, we can look into that. I think one follow up on the biomass and biofuels production is that we tend to import more of that than see local production because of the low cost other places in the US and the existing transport networks that we assume are relatively low cost for moving clean fuels around the place. And so we have a very large, potentially new source of biomass derived fuels coming from like other parts of the country that Oregon could rely on as well.
Well, sure, but when you also overlay that this study is looking at the economic impacts to Oregonians and the resilience benefits to Oregonians, and look at the fact that we're now pelletizing a lot of our lumber mill waste and exporting it to Japan so that they can create electricity out of it. But I think that it would behoove us as Oregonians to look at some scenarios, following up on what OSU is right now doing, just looking at our state forests to convert those latter fuels into renewable diesel, for example. But there's a lot more opportunity out there. We're already seeing some money left on the table in terms of value add exporting our fuels to Japan so they can make it into electricity. So hopefully we'll be looking at biomass as a very viable, renewable natural resource that is available to Oregonians in this model.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you. I see there are a couple of more questions in the chat, and then Dave's hand is up. Dave, is this a clarifying question on what was said so far, or is it additional? If it's additional, I might take it after the couple of ones in the chat that dropped before I saw your hand go up.
Well, I think it's clarifying. So it's along the lines of, I think what Shannon was raising is just to what extent the modeling and scenario planning will dig into feedstock options and the transportation. This is maybe more for the transportation subgroup to talk about, but in terms of the particularly legacy vehicles, I mean, to me, the strategy is going to have a zero carbon fuel long-term strategy married with a shorter term legacy vehicle strategy. So for diesel, renewable diesel, higher, I think you touched on higher levels. Is there ways to higher levels of ethanol for the gasoline side? And then assume that we're going to be looking at biofuels for the aviation. I think Shannon asked as well for the aviation industry in this planning.
Yeah. So we are representing the opportunity for decarbonizing fuel blends, so gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, heavy fuel oil. All of these are blends that could be constituted by some percentage of these different clean fuel sources, and that's one of the things that's being solved for in the model. How much of each of these blends is from clean fuels, and we have the existing biodiesel and other biofuel supply represented in the model on a national basis, and that can get drawn upon by states that are basically willing to pay for that fuel, which are states that have policy that would drive the need for it. So that can be diverted into Oregon or other places if that is the lowest cost opportunity. And one question that we had in the previous group, which was on land use and natural resources, was that we have a data set right now for biomass potential, which is the billion ton study. And we do have adjustments for the Northwest that were made during the 2021 Washington State Energy Strategy that we could use in Oregon that used the LURA model by University of Washington to look specifically at forest and cellulosic biomass opportunities. But we would be really interested in any local Oregon studies on biomass potential that could substitute and give us a more detailed data set than what we currently have. And that would be basically a cost curve for Oregon of biomass potential at different costs.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'm just looking, and I mean, there are a couple of more. I kind of want to move us along to the next topics. There are a couple of questions that came up relating to biofuels. Maybe I'll just read out the last one, and any questions that we don't get to, we will answer questions in writing as well, and supply those later. So there is a question about paper mill liquors. I think we might have covered that, but it also came up. The question is, what about paper mill liquors, and hearing about a waste resource from Angela shipped to Japan for fuel?
So our data sets include the waste biomass that is being produced by industry. But again, if there are more refined surveys of the available biomass and how that will change over time, then we'd be really interested in that to update our inputs.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. So there's another question here from Shannon Sosa, and I'm noticing. I guess I'll just say I encourage everybody to throw questions in, so we can hear from everybody throughout the discussion. So kind of as we move through the topics, please, when we get to one that is yours, or if you want to bring it up, throw it in the chat or raise your hand. Shannon asks for the economy-wide energy modeling and based on existing infrastructure. Shall we assume that dynamic line ratings would be included? I'm sorry, what's WRT?
With respect to, sorry.
Sorry, say that again.
With respect to the capacity
to,
for existing transmission and interconnection. Yeah,
thank you.
Sorry.
God, I'm not up on my normal acronym. So shall we assume the dynamic line rating would be included with respect to the capacity of our existing transmission and distribution infrastructure?
So the model is not a complex transmission model. It is a zonal pipe flow representation of transmission, and so it's not building in any sort of dynamic ratings with respect to weather conditions or anything like that. It is an assessed path rating. It's not even line specific. It is a path that could be represented by multiple lines characterizing that pipe between one state and another, and then the opportunity for expanding that path rating over time. And so our modeling with the electricity sector, it is really better suited to looking out in the long term with the recognition that there are much more detailed models available for the near term, and that would include nodal transmission modeling. It would include detailed loss of load probability modeling, and those are things that the utility modeling process would do a much better job of. So there's a complementary nature between the near-term planning that is the function at the utilities, using these much more detailed near-term models, and then this long-term look, looking across the economy, what kind of investments might we want to make.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful and also troubling, but.
Do you want to elaborate on that, Shannon?
Yeah, I serve on the board for OSEA and also for Ocean, and we've been very active in the PUC space, and we have serious concerns about the modeling that is provided by the utilities. It is very black box, and while we appreciate that it may be more nuanced, it's not transparent, and we don't believe that we are experiencing in their submittals the full capacity of what could be extracted from our existing transmission and distribution systems. Also saying that, I also understand you have constraints on what your budget and your technology allowances are. So I'm certainly not challenging you on this, but just presenting it for the group that there are many among us that have serious concerns about relying on what we consider to be relatively black box, self-serving IRP IOU submittals as baseline for this exercise.
So one other area where I think we are complementary, but is outside of the utility process, is the WestX study, and that is energy solutions with detailed nodal transmission modeling that I think maybe serves the function that you're describing. So I think that could be a useful resource, but it's still a couple of years out from completion at the moment.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, and thanks, Shannon, for elaborating. And sorry if I put you on the spot. But if I hear some things of concern, I'd like to hear why. So I appreciate your answer. So there's a question here about small modular reactors from Martha Dibble. Jeremy.
Yeah. Elaine had her hand up there.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see it. Please.
I think I just wanted to make one clarification that this is Jeremy's already said this, but this is a physical representation of the system, and the individual utilities and things like their portfolios of transmission rights and things like that are not not going to be represented in the model. And so there will be places where this type of analysis is just fundamentally different from what you would see in a utility IRP, and I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Yeah, so I would follow on with what Elaine said too. I had made a note in my notes, citing quickly at CETI, just to make it really clear for you, Shannon, that we have often a very similar experience in terms of the black box and not knowing either. Utilities aren't sharing with us that information either. So when Jeremy is saying it's complementary, what he's saying is it could be complementary, but he's not able to incorporate that IRP transmission information either. We don't have that from the utilities either.
Yeah, thanks, Eileen. Sorry, state of affairs, but that's where we are. We'll keep moving forward.
But I would say that I do think Jeremy's right. I realize the timing isn't optimal, but I do think that the planning that's going on at West Tech and the work that's going into that, and other places in the region, I think has the potential to open up that conversation much more and end up with more transparency than we have had. I recognize that the timing for this modeling is not the same, but I do think that there are efforts that are getting at daylighting transmission.
Thanks, Eileen and Elaine. So the question from Martha Dibble is, I see there's no nuclear SMRs, small modular reactors can provide extra amounts of electricity for data centers, industry, and communities, eliminating the need for transmission. SMRs or transmission reduction seems like that's a viable discussion point.
Yeah, so we're permitting the build of nuclear, so the model can invest in nuclear economically, and SMR is one of the options there. Can also invest in 4th generation nuclear, and the difference being from a physical perspective, other than cost, is that from 4th generation nuclear we can get high temperature heat from the reactor, whereas the SMR is lower temperature. So SMR is basically a electricity only resource where we're building an SMR reactor and a steam turbine. The 4th generation nuclear, we can build the reactor and a steam turbine, but we can also direct that heat into industrial processes. So it could go into high temperature direct air capture or electrolysis. So you could conceivably see use cases where that nuclear is used for power early on, and then it transitions into using more of that thermal heat for production of hydrogen or capture of carbon in future years. But our default assumption is that we are not going to permit the high temperature heat usage in industry as part of the reference case, because it has quite a big impact on where you build resources around the West. And it's not a currently proven technology, or at least it's not a technology that we see on the grid today.
And I might just add that our kind of point of entry for discussing the reference case is that we would not cite nuclear in Oregon to kind of in alignment with state policy. So that would be kind of the WEC-wide footprint wherever it's allowed to be cited. I'm now turning to Jessica to see if there are any other. I see Martha's hand just went up. Martha.
Yeah, I want to discuss more about the no nuclear in Oregon, because I think that's something that ought to go into the master plan for this, the strategy. The fact that no nuclear in Oregon goes back to Lloyd Barbette, long ways back, Trojan, the whole thing. And it is something that I believe the state needs to address in its long-term objectives for this project.
Thanks for that comment. And I think that there is the option, and I see here Robert Westerman saying, I mean, we could discuss a scenario we have 5 scenarios, and it's a limited number of scenarios. And so I think that there's a discussion on what we choose to test out in them. But this is something that could be considered for one of those scenarios. I think, Jeremy, it might be helpful to just, I don't think you had a list of this, but to maybe name off some of because there's this kind of bucket of emerging technologies that come up farther down the road, and it might just be worth speaking to that for a moment, if you don't mind me asking you a bit off the cuff, because there's, and just how the model kind of addresses them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it'll be hard for me to remember a comprehensive list, but there's a principle kind of underpinning the technologies that are included in our model, where we don't want to be modeling anything that is just in the early stages of pilot testing, or definitely nothing that is at the lab scale, just because we want it to be a technology that is commercially viable and has some kind of forecast on what it's going to cost, or a realistic forecast on what it's going to cost. And so that is our principle for including a technology or not. The one exception to that is direct air capture, that we could consider direct air capture still in a sort of a pilot phase, but and we're not including in the reference scenario. But if we were to push further than 80%, then some negative emissions technologies are needed, and direct air capture is a primary option there. So we include it in the model. Other things that are in there that would be considered emerging would be advanced geothermal. So deeper geothermal sites that could take advantage of modern geothermal technologies, long duration storage options, and then just on the technology side, where we're talking about solar and lithium ion and wind and so on, we are representing the movement down the cost curve that NREL is forecasting, based on improvements in materials and improvements in economies of scale in production, and so on. So we're trying to represent a future where technological progress exists, but recognizing that when we get to, say, 2035, 2040, there's probably a lot of technologies that we couldn't even forecast being on the horizon right now, that would be part of our planning at that point. And so it's kind of necessarily conservative in that respect from a technology perspective.
Thanks, Jeremy. It just seemed like we were being set up for a little bit of background there. Martha, I'm gonna ask you to hold for a moment because I see some new people have spoken up. So just in the spirit of giving everybody a chance to be heard, and then we'll circle back to you if we can. I see a question from Ranfus. How detailed will we get in each scenario on economic and employment impacts? It will be important to know what additional needs are needed to inform key stakeholders on the topic of economic and employment impacts. And I can probably answer that, Jeremy, unless you prefer to do it. But I can just say that where our plan is to look at to wait for the results of the modeling, and then to look at the employment impacts as they relate to what we find in terms of kind of how the system sugars out in terms of what's built, and then look at the jobs in those sectors and develop some data on jobs coming out of that. That's still so that's going to come a little bit later in the process because it's reliant on the model outputs, and that's a piece that's still a little bit under development, but should be happening, and we should have nailed down a timeline relatively soon for that. And then I see a question from Shannon Sosa wondering to what extent that high-level view of transmission and distribution captures how much of our generation is lost through transmission. So maybe, Jeremy, you can speak to line losses a little bit.
Yep. Yeah, so the transmission representation is explicit in zone-to-zone transmission, and the losses associated with that transmission are represented. Then within the zone, then we have a high-level representation of the bulk system transmission and the distribution. And each one of those, they have costs associated with expanding that. So if our loads are growing and we're delivering more, then we have historical costs per additional megawatt hour representing the sort of generic growth. We're not representing the network itself, but just this high level cost representation. And then we also have the average line losses associated with the bulk system and the distribution. And so we are capturing it, but we're capturing it in a way where it's not a detailed network. It is using high level averages.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'd like to propose that we jump to another slide that we have in the presentation, because I think it'll help us kind of deepen the discussion and get to some of the other questions that might be in people's minds. So I'm going to share my screen and hand it over to Joni to get us talking a little bit about the scenarios and some of the ways that we might want to take the discussion. Let's see how smoothly I can do this. How is that? Can everybody see the slide?
I can see your slide, Edith. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah.
So good afternoon, everyone. Joni Slager. I'm a senior clean policy specialist here at Odo. Really excited to have you in the room and have this discussion. Before we jump into the substance, I just wanted to pause here. We've got a little less than an hour left, but I do want to reassure everyone we are accepting written comments, and we do know that you might have later ideas as you reflect on today's discussion, or may have thoughts you're not necessarily comfortable raising in this forum, or other things. So if you don't speak today because you're not comfortable, or just don't have a chance due to the time, just be aware we will be taking written comment, and we'll circle back on that at the very end with kind of more on the process there, but just to guide that. So we've framed here some of the what if questions. As Jeremy and Edith have both talked about, our Oregon energy strategy will feature 1 reference scenario and 5 alternative scenarios. And we found it's helpful to talk about those in some cases together. The alternative scenarios you can think of as the reference scenario, but with 1 different assumption or 1 lever pulled on what we think might happen differently. So we've got some uncertainties framed up here to walk through, but I think it might be helpful to think about that in terms of what are the assumptions that we think would be appropriate to have in all of this scenarios because they carry out from the reference into the others, and what are differences that we would think would be really helpful to model in one of the alternatives to kind of see what the difference is there to help inform the policy discussions we'll be having next year. And before I jump into the first question here, I will just pause for a minute. Edith and Jeremy, if you have anything else on the high level framing of here, do you want to add there?
No, the only thing I'll add is that I think, sorry, Joni, if I'm repeating what you just said, but maybe I'm saying it in different words. What we've tried to do here is to elevate the places where we see the levers that make the biggest difference. And so probably would be of kind of highest concern to folks in the room, but it's certainly not an exhaustive list. And so we're also open to other questions. But Joni, I'll pass it back to you to run through this list and see how that conversation goes.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Ida. So one of the first things we've flagged here is kind of uncertainty surrounding load growth. And this ultimately is a function of the uncertainties with kind of the various drivers that contribute to load growth. So looking for input both on drivers that we might consider to be a switch from something that we see currently, but might be using a fuel other than electricity, electrification, where we're see that shift over time. But it can also include completely new loads that are locating here due to market forces, excuse me, that wouldn't necessarily be part of the energy system today, but we might expect to see more of in the years to come. So that is something you could imagine, like new data centers being located in the West.
You can shut me off anytime. I feel there is an intermodal port that's projected and planned for Coos Bay that is looking at securing funding for that, which would greatly expand the maritime fueling and shoreside servicing energy and clean fuels needs for the coast, which is currently energy islanded. So I don't know if that should go into its own scenario, or maybe some kind of a rapid build out of other manufacturing and transportation opportunities for Oregon.
Thanks, Shannon. And by all means, feel free to keep speaking up. We've got specific questions here, but excited to hear everyone's thoughts and inputs. Maybe I'll move to the next question here, just really underscore this point of kind of something that might be helpful to model. Our reference scenario, we're going to be trying to look at what we think is a realistic and reasonable amount of load growth based on what we know today. And we know we're not going to get everything perfectly right, but one of the alternatives might ask kind of what if load growth is higher or lower than expected. So don't want to be limiting to some of the drivers I mentioned, but welcome thoughts on that.
Jody, we have a comment from Dave Fantoff in the chat. Just flagging for you.
Yes, thank you, Dave. So I think you have a couple people on the phone, so I'll just read it out. I think Dave says, I think load growth, what and where, along with transmission constraints, where new lines for siting and greater efficiency of the system, combined with storage needs, are the two largest uncertainties. And then we also have Tim Hemstreet speaking. Data centers is the major driver of load growth we anticipate. And I don't know if it would be helpful to flag. We're seeing those uncertainties in regions. We're seeing those uncertainties in utility IRPs, in the power plan that Northwest Power Conservation Council is working on. But in the face of that uncertainty, for purposes of this Oregon energy strategy that we're hoping will be kind of reiterative, kind of trying to figure out what the right basis is to say that for this, what our assumptions will be. I don't know, Jeremy or Edith, you have more to add on that?
Yeah, so I think that I totally agree with those two comments, that that load growth is a major uncertainty, and the two factors there are, one, the kind of the policy and economically driven change on the demand side that is moving us towards an electrified future. So how much we see year on year of electric vehicle uptake and how much electrification in buildings do we see. And that would be probably the largest driver of load growth in the long term. But in the near term, we're still kind of at the beginning of that transition, and the data center growth seems to be the larger factor there, and pretty significant in many forecasts. So we talked to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council about what they're assuming in their forecasts, and they've got data from different utilities on what they're predicting in that area. And so we, as a starting point, are thinking that we would rely on what the Power Council is forecasting to happen over time in the reference scenario. But the error bars around that are very large, because knowing when and how much of this new type of load growth is coming is a really challenging question. I don't think that anybody really knows the answer to that, and the consequences could be pretty large. And so that is one area where, if we were to run a what if question looking at this, then that would, those two factors on load growth would be potential areas that we'd want to incorporate into that question. And then Dave's other comment there on the transmission constraints, citing new lines. We also, that's one of the biggest swings in strategy that we see happening, whether we can rely on imports coming in from other places, or is it going to be a more zone specific strategy, because we just can't build out these lines either in time or in total. And that's another good candidate for a what if scenario.
Thanks, Jeremy.
And maybe I can, I'm sorry, Joni, I'll just jump in to say that electrification is certainly a topic that we're thinking about quite a bit, because it relates to how we meet our clean energy goals. And so that's a topic that has come up in the energy efficiency and load flexibility working group. It will likely come up in the transportation working group too. And so there's kind of this overlap between the different groups. And again, is why kind of on August 22nd, we plan to circle back and share kind of what we heard and where we've landed And if you don't have something that you want to share now, but that comes up to your mind later, we're also very happy to receive any written information relating to this, since it's at least one of those things that's making it's, I mean, it's a big topic. It's very important, particularly the very near term question on data centers is like the energy story that's in the headlines these days, and is top of mind for system planners.
Thanks, Ida. So, as we move through these, still welcome comments on any, but I'll just kind of frame the third question we have here. I'd start by noting that we do have a limited number of scenarios. So one of the things we'll be trying to assess is whether a particular alternative scenario might provide information that's useful to us on multiple fronts. We do have multiple different working groups working through different issues, but our hope would be that we end up with 5 scenarios that will be useful, but might also be able to kind of shine light on a number of different questions. So the third what if question we've flagged here on this slide is kind of what if the siting and permitting and the reference was constrained differently. And I think that's helpful to think of in terms of how we might imagine a future differently if we see a lot of rooftop solar uptake versus a lot of utility scale solar. You know, there's pros and cons to both sides of development, and it is a least cost model. So we could imagine there being policies that promote more rooftop solar for purposes of resiliency or local energy security that might not necessarily be selected by themselves. So that's kind of a what if question that cross-cuts across land use and electricity and other issues, but I kind of wonder people's thoughts or reactions on that, or other thoughts spurred by this.
Yeah, I'll get off mute on this one. This is a rain feast. Yeah, it sounds good. Maybe we'll get more to this in the workforce conversation. I hate to belabor the point, but like I think a lot of the what if scenarios are still important for me on just like the economic and jobs impact, as important as to make our energy goals and plans on this one. So I get the focus on cost, least cost, but just want to sort of bump up again just in each of these scenarios, balancing least cost, especially in light of that it could be projects outside the state, making sure we're thinking about balancing with jobs and employment opportunities in Oregon for workers in the energy transition. So just wanted to just kind of note that and balancing in this what if scenario.
Yeah, thank you for that. All right. I'm not seeing any other hands raised.
I don't know if it's an old hand or a new hand, but I see Shannon's hand up. Shannon, is that a new hand?
Me again. We'd be really interested, and again, I'm talking on behalf of and this is going back to my dynamic line rating question, that a scenario that looks at extracting the most value that we have out of our existing transmission system, and it kind of gets down to your fourth question here for short term or midterm, if 10 years is considered long term, but what's the most that we can do with our existing transmission system, and what are those implications for the energy resilience and energy security of Oregon's communities? I'm just the dynamic line rating, it's very low hanging fruit. In talking to some of the utilities, it's 18 months that can be employed. So that's much shorter than 10 years. And OSEA will definitely be providing this group with just some of from our membership in the solar and storage industry of what these cost points are for a 5 or a 10K or a megawatt, or these different cost points that you're free to just kind of spread across that scenario as possible, but really interested in understanding what is the full potential of our existing transmission and what would those impacts be with respect to strengthening our community energy resilience for Oregonians. And you can lay on Rainfeast's question with what are those impacts to the economic development, both from the CapEx and talking to you from the end of the line down on the south coast of Oregon. What also are the cost of pain points that are avoided by having a more secure, local, accessible generation and storage portfolio? So physical constraints of our existing transmission system with readily available, rapidly deployable software and hardware solutions that could allow us to extract even more while we're waiting for the planning process of longer term transmission reconductoring and or additional lines.
Thanks, Shannon. Sounds great. Jeremy, I'll pause to see if you had any question or follow up on what Shannon shared, but it sounds like
Yeah,
Shannon
I
will
think
look
it's-
forward to written comments from you. Go ahead, Jeremy.
It's a great point, and I think it's one that we're possibly at too high of a level to be incorporating it directly, because it's really about the network and the access to specific areas for renewables in the network. But it does reflect in terms of cost, and so if there are opportunities there that would reduce cost because we're using smart grid solutions on the bulk power system, then that could be reflected in the modeling that we're doing. I just don't know if we have the data that we could fall back on to incorporate that there. But it does seem like that's something that I think with utility planning work could be incorporated as not directly into the modeling that we're doing right now, but as a strategy that would potentially be valuable in the state energy strategy. But I would, if Edith has any thoughts on that, I would pass it to her.
I'm sorry, Jeremy. I was literally getting ready to paste a different question to the chat and didn't hear a sentence. Very sorry. Yeah, I'm doing a bit of back. So I have nothing to add. I did see, I don't know, Joni, if you want me to read these or if you want to do it. I see that there are a couple of other comments. I want to try to get these in order. So there's from Tim, there's, I believe, siting and permitting constraints for utility scale projects are likely to become more restrictive as the most readily developed sites move to the rear view mirror and there becomes public fatigue around energy facility siting / development. And I suppose, Jeremy, maybe that's a question on whether in other modeling exercises you've seen a similar dynamic play out.
Sorry, can you repeat the first half of the question?
Yeah, so the question is, siting and permitting constraints for utility scale projects are likely to become more restrictive as the most readily developed sites move to the rear view mirror. Essentially, once the low hanging fruit is picked, it's going to get harder.
Yeah.
And is that something that you've seen play out and that we might expect to see in the modeling here too?
Yeah, and that's actually a topic that we were talking about in the land use working group earlier today. So the way that we're representing the opportunity for renewable siting in the model is based on very granular use of land use layers on which sites are restricted for building out renewables, which sites will be challenging to build renewables, which sites are quite easy to build renewables. And in general, the sites that will be built out earliest are the ones that are relatively plain sailing for development, where they make economic sense because they are high quality renewables, high wind capacity factors, solar capacity factors. Their costs of interconnection are relatively low because they have proximity to transmission, and that they are on land that can be developed relatively easily without other mitigation needs. And those would be represented in our supply curve of renewable opportunities as low cost resources, because they would be they'd be high capacity factor, their interconnection costs would be relatively low, and they would fall on land that in that intersection of land use layers would have been available for development. We are getting at that challenge of it getting harder over time in a partial sense, because we still have the same resource siting availability going forward in time. We just are now, because we would build the most economic resources early, then the less economic resources will be available later. And those are the ones that are lower quality and have longer interconnections, so they are more costly to interconnect into the grid. But there's another factor that we're not getting at, which is that that there can be increasing opposition as you're putting more renewables into an area. It may get harder to site renewables on the same kind of land use. So the only way that we can target that is through the assumptions about where we can put renewables in the state, and the idea for that, which we haven't developed the data set yet, but the ARISA tool is a means of layering those different types of land use together and identifying what sites are developable and what sites would be challenging or not developable.
Thanks, Jeremy. I might jump in, Joni, since you're running the slide, I can jump in with a few questions that I'm seeing coming in from the group. So there's a question that from Martha Dibble, that maybe Martha, you can come off mute and just explain, because I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. You say, what is the long-term goal in supporting more PUDs?
So PUDs are public utility districts. This is where you don't have a commercial utility. You have a community board that forms a utility.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, my question is what you mean by what the long-term goal is in supporting them. Is it supporting them in terms of supporting them where they have resource needs, if there's load growth on the system, in addition to the power they might buy, they might have through bilateral contracts with BPA, or is it a different question?
Well, it's more that these should be encouraged, and especially they could be used for small communities. They with the increase in retirement communities, you could have, if the retirement community were large, you could have a PUD that would supply a whole retirement community. And this all leads to less transmission, so that you would have, you would be having smaller centers of utility use.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying. And I mean, my quick answer is that I don't know about such a strategy, but I think it's a really interesting comment and one that we can take on board. But it's probably outside of the scope of the modeling that we're doing, and it gets more into the policy discussions that we'll have early next year when we start talking about the how do we get there. There's a question relating to offshore wind from Robert Westerman. Are there different scenarios for offshore wind being considered, 3 gigs, 10 gigs, etc.? Is there a scenario where offshore wind is deployed off the Oregon coast but not interconnected with our grid?
So if we're looking back to our most recent Oregon scenarios, which were Net Zero Northwest study last year, then just economically, without any target for achieving offshore wind, we had 1.2 gigawatts of offshore wind developed. But that is a lot lower than we've seen in past studies in Oregon. And the reason for that is that the market for a offshore wind shape is kind of getting eaten by the 25 gigawatts of offshore wind targeted in California, which we modeled in that study. And so it diminishes the value of building more than the 25 gigawatts in Oregon. We can also consider targets, and we have modeled scenarios where we included targets for offshore wind as well. So that's an option for a particular scenario. We could also incorporate the second part of that comment, which is that these are not interconnected with the grid. So in our model, we can represent energy parks. So that's one option where it is a energy park that is weakly connected or not connected at all, that is producing clean fuels from that energy. And so it could be a combination of different types of fuels production in that area. That would probably not be economic compared to some other energy park opportunities where you have large amounts of solar and wind in the same location. Or we could represent it as connected south into California. So there's some options there if we wanted to characterize a scenario that was specifically looking at offshore wind.
Thanks, Jeremy. We've got more questions and comments in the chat. I'm going to pause for a minute and just kind of flag the 2 remaining questions we have on the slide. Just have a common understanding. We've already started discussing transmission, but we do recognize transmission development as a significant uncertainty that could drive whether a number of different resources can be developed and available to serve Oregon's needs over the coming years. So we have flagged that, kind of really understanding what amount of transmission potential is available, could be used, and what timeframes we think that it might become available in. And then the last question we have here is wondering about what would look differently if we had an alternative scenario that looked at what if Oregon had a policy that was more ambitious than the energy policy objectives we're going to be setting the model to meet right now. So that might look like what if there was an economy-wide greenhouse gas reduction target that was more ambitious than what we're looking at right now. So open floor, welcome discussions and questions on any of those. Just wanted to frame those up before we get too far along here. I believe we've got some comments here on transmission. One that the Boardman to Hemingway transmission line still isn't cited. So if that's an example of kind of the timelines that we should be thinking about, then we're much better off using the current transmission system and small modular reactors, which don't require transmission lines. Noting that timeline that for Boardman to Hemingway has been well over 10 years. So acknowledge that. I think Jeremy mentioned keeping in mind some of what we are seeing with recent line development, but appreciate that comment. And then I also see a comment here from John Garrett. Hello. It's in the chat. Specifically, he's asking how we're treating renewable hydrogen and the different ways of producing it and energy losses associated with them. And John, you acknowledge there's a direct fuels use that I think we'll get into more of the specifics here, but flag that in the chat, Jeremy, if there's some high-level thoughts you can share with this group on that.
Yeah. So the way that we are representing it is that we're building out each of the steps in producing the hydrogen, in storing it, transporting it, converting it, delivering it, and depending on the cost of each one of those steps, then that's driving the size of that market, and two, what is the most cost-effective way to use hydrogen. And it's pretty dependent on the forecast for electrolyzers in the near term, because what we've seen recently is that the electrolyzer forecasts have been more optimistic than electrolyzer pricing that has materialized this year. And so it's actually, forecasted from 2 years ago, 1 year ago, it would have been forecasted to be cheaper, and that has had a dampening effect on the amount of electrolyzer growth that we've seen this year. If forecasts through 2030 are accurate, then we would see 45V being a very effective economic signal for growth of hydrogen production. But it also drives a particular pattern of production because it is a production tax credit. And so as a hydrogen producer, you are incentivized to produce as many hydrogen molecules as possible for the capacity that you install. And so operations of an electrolyzer will probably be close to 100% capacity factor through the end of the IRA period, at least. And that shapes the near-term opportunities for hydrogen versus the long-term opportunities for hydrogen, where you're back to a world without IRA, or presumably without IRA incentives for new hydrogen production after that. So we're including forecasts following down cost curves on electrolyzers, on conversion processes, so Fischer-Tropsch and Haber-Bosch, and methanation processes. That you mentioned storage specifically, and storage is really expensive. And so for the most part, storage is minimized in our model. We don't build very much of it because it is so expensive. And so that lends itself to more direct use cases for hydrogen, where it's being sent to a conversion process and turned into a liquid fuel, for example. And then liquid fuels are much cheaper to store. And so we tend to be trying to avoid large-scale storage of hydrogen. The exceptions to that, which we don't see in Oregon, are storage in underground natural formations, which we see in certain places in Utah, for example. But that is about the extent of the large-scale hydrogen storage that we get in our modeling.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy. That was more or less just what I was looking for. So thank you.
Great.
Great. Happy to hear it, John. I think next question I see in the chat, asking if there's discussion to set a more ambitious goal. It seems to be an open question as to whether or not we can meet our current goals. What if Oregon doesn't meet our goals? Clarify, as Jeremy explained earlier, the model will always be looking to what is necessary to achieve the energy policy objectives across the board. and it will be showing cost optimization for that happening. There are different policies, different ways we could set the alternatives to help show us kind of what the differentials are if the same strategy that would be good for our current emissions target would also be the same least cost to meet a different target. Is one way I've been thinking about that. But Edith, I would welcome you if you have further reactions to that.
Yeah, thanks, Joni. I think that, the question is really whether folks see this as a good opportunity to see how it's different, how kind of what the difference is between a reference to meet our current energy goals and what more might be needed or what differently might be needed if we were to have a higher goal. Washington State has set a 95% greenhouse gas emissions reduction goal, which is higher than what we have right now. There's a federal goal of net zero, and so they're kind of floating around, have been floated in Oregon too. The Oregon Climate Action Commission has suggested a 95% goal, kind of based on the research and the science. And so that leads us to ask this question of the group. It doesn't answer the question of how hard it's going to be to meet our current goals. It's really more of a question of whether we want to take this opportunity to understand if something more ambitious were to come in, what would that be? What might that look like? And how might that be different?
I think also the second part of that question on whether or not the state can meet its current goals is something that can be interrogated through the modeling that is happening in the energy strategy, and not by modeling scenarios that don't actually meet the goals, but just understanding what it takes to get to those goals is useful information for how hard and how fast the state has to move to actually accomplish them, and particularly in cases that are more constrained than the reference scenario. So for example, if we can't build new transmission, if that were one of the 5 scenarios that we model, and so we can't rely on renewables or clean energy from outside of the state beyond what the existing transmission can carry, then what does that mean in terms of locating resources inside of Oregon? And it's likely to be a fast trajectory of build out for in-state resources that will be in compliance with meeting the goals, but we can also ask the question, how hard is that to accomplish? What must happen in Oregon for that rate of build to occur? And so that those questions about feasibility can be interrogated through looking at those types of results.
Thanks, Jeremy. I know we've got more comments and questions, but I think we're just about time to hand over. So before I do that, just wanted to acknowledge I am realizing we do have 5 kind of examples on this slide, and we happen to be modeling 5 alternative scenarios, but those aren't picked yet. So if you have feedback on what you think would be the most useful uncertainty for us to model differently in one of the alternatives, or maybe an alternative that you think would be particularly useful to answer because it might shed light on a number of different cross-cutting factors, as we mentioned earlier. Just a reminder that that is definitely input we are interested in seeking. And with that, Edith, I'll hand back to you. But thank you all for the wonderful discussion and questions.
Yeah, thanks, Joni. And I, at risk of, oh no, when I stopped showing that, I lost the chat. Oh no, there it is. At risk of, I won't take us over, I promise, because the conclusion will be pretty short. But I think that there's an interesting question here from Brenda that I just wanted to at least get maybe a brief answer on, or at least some insights, Jeremy. So, because I think it's an interesting one, and it gets to the heart of some of what we've been hearing about distributed utility scale and kind of what and resilience. So Brenda asks, with uncertainties around transmission distribution, increasing waiting times to interconnect, and increasing demand, would consumers be looking to supply their own energy, maybe integrating several energy sources? In these scenarios, more permitting flexibility to generate power on site, incentives or rates to promote the investment would be necessary. I'll just say up front that we won't get into the policy levers in the modeling, but Jeremy, maybe you can just speak to the first part of the question relating to, you know, what the model might say there.
So there's definitely options to be modeling higher distributed energy resource scenarios. And this is something that we found in other state analyses where the movement on the grid scale side has to be very rapid to meet the targets. And there's questions of feasibility on, can you site and permit build out that amount of grid scale resource and the transmission that's required to either access it if it's out of state or to integrate it, deliver it in state. And even though distributed resources are generally more expensive than their grid scale counterparts, they are a way of mitigating the risk associated with siting and permitting large scale or large quantities of grid scale resources. So that is definitely a candidate if people are interested in asking that question of how much of the burden can be taken away from siting and permitting these grid scale resources by building out a larger distributed energy set of investments. That would be a scenario that we could look at.
Thanks. So, I mean, with that, I see Jessica just pasted in where you can follow up on more information on the other working groups and opportunities to input. We have a couple of slides at the end, but I'm not going to put them up. We're just going to send them around because they essentially just have links to our comment portal where you can put comments. We've modified that. There was a comment a couple of meetings ago that people couldn't attach files there. So now you should be able to attach files if you want to submit something a bit longer. We will be digesting everything that we heard today, and our plan is to reflect the comments that we received, particularly kind of suggestions or recommendations, and to respond to those in writing. And August 22nd, we'll come back, and as I said at the beginning, we'll be kind of presenting what we've heard from all the working groups and how that's sugared out in terms of the scenarios that we would recommend and some of the key assumptions that might have floated to the top as being of particular interest. And so with that, I just want to thank everybody for your time. I look forward to speaking with you all again on the 22nd. And I see a question from Shannon about why this group is only meeting once. And the answer is really a combination of a timeline that's quite tight to get the modeling all in place. And that's why we're kind of adding this additional layer of kind of written comments to enable us to take on board additional thoughts and reflections that you all have. It's also why we're doing that meeting on the 22nd. So it's going to combine all of the groups. But if you consider we just have 5 scenarios, then there should be an opportunity to kind of dig into those. But that's my quick answer to that. But we're very happy to have more back and forth with folks to dig into areas. Particularly, I think that there were some interesting areas here that came up, kind of starting with the discussion earlier around biofuels. And I think to the extent that folks have data that they want to share with us, that's very welcome to make sure that we're taking into account kind of the latest and greatest information that's coming in from around the state and the region. All right, well, thanks everybody. Really appreciate your time. And this is going to we're going to put this up online and have the recording available in the PowerPoint as well. And don't hesitate to reach out with any additional comments. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.